Hello, and welcome to a screencast on Muckraking, the golden age of reform journalism. This is Chapter 6 of Streitmatter's Mightier Than the Sword. As Streitmatter points out in the introduction, the U.S. economy in the second half of the 19th century experienced an unprecedented level of expansion. The inequality that existed in the nation left us with a country the founders would not have claimed. The government had become, based on the amount of corruption and political influence at every level of government, a government of the corporation, by the corporation, and for the corporation. The muckrakers, as investigative reporters, boldly accused the nation of auctioning off its birthright for private gain, according to Streitmatter. The muckraking journalism of the period provoked political, industrial, and social change not through erudite intellectual discourse, but by describing the sordid details to create a new style of magazine writing that was as gripping as it was edifying. The term muckrakers was coined by President Theodore Roosevelt, who thought that the muckrakers dwelt too much on the negative. Roosevelt, of course, was one of the leaders of the progressive movement, one of the individuals responsible for the great social achievements of the progressive era. And muckraking, as a part of this movement, established a level of investigative journalism that created a benchmark for journalism to come, and in terms of its pervasiveness and its impact, I think it's fair to embrace Streitmatter's claim that muckraking established a high water mark that remains unsurpassed. The connection between the predecessors of the muckrakers, such as Nast in his crusade against the corruption of Tammany Hall, is made explicit by muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens when he entitles his first article on municipal corruption, "Tweed Days in St. Louis." St. Louis, the fourth city in size in the United States, is making two announcements to the world, wrote Steffens. One, that it is the worst governed city in the land. The other, that it wishes all men to come there for the World's Fair and see it. It isn't our worst governed city. Philadelphia is that, but St. Louis is worth examining while we have it inside out. Tweed Days in St. Louis appeared in McClure's magazine in October of 1902. McClure's was, in the opinion of most journalism historians, the greatest of the muckraking journals. Steffens' article exposed corruption in St. Louis in a way that created a popular awareness that in turn provided St. Louis Attorney Joseph W. Folk with the necessary public support to prosecute dozens of city officials involved in such corrupt acts as election fraud and contract fraud. So the work of Steffens had almost immediate concrete results. Steffens praised Folk, writing, "There is a man at work there, one man working all alone, but he is the circuit, district, or state attorney, and he is doing his duty." The corruption of St. Louis came from the top. The best citizens, the merchants and big financiers, used to rule the town, and they ruled it well. They set out to outstrip Chicago. Steffens' series on municipal corruption was eventually published in book form and titled The Shame of the Cities, and the legacy of that book was that it helped to usher in the city manager form of government, a way of helping to reduce city corruption by hiring professional administrators who had training and experience, as Streitmatter points out, in operating large organizations. S.S. McClure, the Irish immigrant who published McClure's magazine, made a conscious decision to take on the enormous power of corporations, and he did so by singling out Standard Oil as an example of the corporate power and the negative impact that corporate power had on our nation. The reporter who was to take on Standard Oil was Ida Tarbell, and she was taking on the country's oldest and largest monopoly, a monopoly that was responsible for 90% of oil, and so she was also taking on one of the most powerful corporations in the world. Tarbell began the series in November of 1902 with an account of how Standard Oil had achieved its position thanks to Rockefeller's shrewd and ruthless approach to competition. In one instance, Rockefeller told a widow that he would help her and gave her $79,000 for a refinery that was worth $200,000. In another case, Standard Oil officials bribed a worker to sabotage a competing refinery, and in yet another example, Standard Oil forced another company out of business by paying its most valued employee to move to California. Tarbell became known as the terror of the trust and the queen of the muckrakers, and her series on Standard Oil boosted circulation for McClure's magazine from 350,000 to 500,000 and led to many similar investigations. The result of Tarbell's investigation was a Department of Justice lawsuit in 1909, finding the general result of the investigation has been to disclose the existence of numerous and flagrant discriminations by the railroads in behalf of the Standard Oil Company and its affiliated corporations. The evidence is, in fact, absolutely conclusive that the Standard Oil Company charges altogether excessive prices where it meets no competition, and particularly where there is little likelihood of competitors entering the field, and that, on the other hand, where competition is active, it frequently cuts prices to a point which leaves even the Standard little or no profit, and which more often leaves no profit to the competitor, whose costs are ordinarily somewhat higher. With comparatively few exceptions, mainly of other large concerns in California, the Standard has been the sole beneficiary of such discriminations. In almost every section of the country, that company has been found to enjoy some unfair advantages over its competitors, and some of these discriminations affect enormous areas. So Standard arranging for special rates for shipping its oil with the railroad company rates that would not be available to its competitors, and as a result its competitors' higher cost made it more difficult for them to compete with Standard Oil. Another muckraking journalist, Ray Stannard Baker, exposed the growing power of labor unions. His articles led to the indictment of the mayor of San Francisco, Eugene Schmitz, in 1906. Retta Child Dorr, who had begun her journalism career as the editor of the women's department of the New York Evening Post, and then joined the staff of Hampton's magazine, exposed the working conditions of female and child workers in factories, mills, and department stores, and her work was reprinted as What 8 Million Women Want. Edwin Markham, known as the poet of the muckrakers, wrote a series on child labor for Cosmopolitan in 1906. He called child labor a cruel and wasteful fungus that destroys the present and threatens the future, and lamented, "O dollars, how diabolical are the crimes committed in thy name." There is work that profits children, and there is work that brings profit only to employers, wrote photographer Lewis Hine in 1908. The object of employing children is not to train them, but to get high profits from their work. Another benefit of the muckraking journalism of the day was to make Americans aware of the poor quality of the food and medicine that they consumed, that all too often endangered rather than improved their health. Medicines containing alcohol, morphine, or cocaine were destroying people's health and transforming unwitting consumers into unintentional drug addicts. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle documented the horrible working conditions of the meatpacking industry, in which workers sometimes fell into huge vats where they were processed, canned, and passed along to consumers. Sinclair wrote, "As for the other men who worked in tank rooms full of steam, they fell into the vats, and when they were fished out, there was never enough of them left to be worth exhibiting. All but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Durham's pure leaf lard." Upton Sinclair had originally intended to expose the working conditions in the meatpacking industry, but the attention of the public was fixated on the food safety issues exposed by the novel. In fact, Sinclair bitterly admitted his celebrity rose not because the public cared anything about the workers, but simply because the public did not want to eat tubercular beef. Despite the failure of his original mission, The Jungle became the literary sensation of the time, and its legacy was the passage of the Meat Inspection Act. So again, muckraking journalism is having real concrete effects on the lives of ordinary Americans. The 1900 census reported that 80 million Americans spent a total of $59 million each year on patent medicines. More of that money went to pay the cost of advertising in newspapers and magazines and on billboards than into either production cost or profit. So the conduit for information on these patent medicines, these drugs of dubious benefit and dubious quality, the conduit for that information was actually the magazines of the day. The idea then that these so-called tonics, elixirs, and syrups were beneficial was finding its way into the public mind through the media that was then to turn on the industry and run a campaign that would result in the reform of the industry. These tonics, elixirs, and syrups contained up to 80% alcohol and often had morphine, cocaine, or the heart stimulant digitalis as a basic ingredient. In 1892, the Ladies' Home Journal announced that it would thereafter accept no advertisements of patent medicines for its pages. It was a pioneer stroke, according to Streitmatter. During the following 2 years, 7 other newspapers and periodicals followed suit. So, realizing that they were complicit in the dissemination of information about these patent medicines that created the demand for them, the magazines and newspapers that chose to participate in this boycott of patent medicine ads were knowingly sacrificing the advertising dollars associated with patent medicine, and it was a big source of revenue for many publications. So this is truly a bold move. The Ladies' Home Journal was edited at the time by Edward William Bach, who wrote, "A mother who would hold up her hands in holy horror at the thought of her child drinking a glass of beer which contains from 2 to 5% alcohol gives to that child with her own hands a patent medicine that contains from 17 to 44% alcohol, to say nothing of opium and cocaine." Collier's joined the campaign against patent medicine, as did McClure's, Good Housekeeping, Saturday Evening Post, and Everybody's Magazine. Collier's announced, "We spoke out about patent medicines and dropped $80,000 in a year." So that's the advertising revenue they sacrificed as part of their campaign against patent medicines. By 1906, Ladies' Home Journal believed the muckrakers had raised public awareness to the point that it could take proactive measures. Bach printed an act to regulate the manufacture and sale of patent medicines, urging readers to clip out the simulated bill and send it to their congressmen in Washington. So here we have the news media actually proposing a specific solution to a prevalent social problem, right? The editor of the Ladies' Home Journal has printed a model act and submitted it to the readers for their approval as citizens, and suggested that they clip that and send it to their congressmen in Washington. As a result, the Pure Food and Drug Act of June 30th, 1906 provided federal inspection of meat products and forbade the manufacture, sale, or transportation of adulterated food products and poisonous patent medicines. So again, concrete results from investigative reporting, right? The act arose due to public education and exposés from muckrakers such as Upton Sinclair and Samuel Hopkins Adams, social activist Florence Kelley, researcher Harvey W. Wiley, and President Theodore Roosevelt. Collier's had recognized the power of images, and you'll notice the symbolism of this cover. The teeth are bottles of medicine, the cheeks are money bags, and we have the very clear statements: slow poison for little children and babies' soothing syrup, opium and laudanum, all over the title of Death's Laboratory. In addition to attacking corporations and patent medicines and local civic corruption, the muckraking period produced a major reform of how we elect members of the Senate. In 1905, William Randolph Hearst purchased Cosmopolitan for $400,000 and chose novelist David Graham Phillips to conduct his expose of exposés. Published in February of 1906, the series The Treason of the Senate served as an expose of the corruption of the U.S. Senate, particularly the corporate magnate turned Senator Nelson Aldrich from Rhode Island. Hearst recruited the well-known investigative journalist Charles Edward Russell to come to work for Cosmopolitan. Historian Louis Filler has called Russell the leader of the muckrakers for contributing important studies in almost every field in which they ventured. Most of Russell's work was of a pioneering nature: beef trust, railroads, tenements, and the farm problem. His real topic was injustice, wherever it was to be found. Articles written by Russell included 2 collections, At the Throat of the Republic and What Are You Going to Do About It? Note again the reference to the earlier period and the nod, if you will, to Nast and his crusade against Tammany Hall. What are you going to do about it, you'll recall, was the tagline that Nast assigned to Boss Tweed. Other articles by Russell included The Growth of Caste in America and Colorado, New Tricks in an Old Game. Jacob Riis was a muckraking journalist and photographer known for his dedication to using his photographic and journalistic talents to help the impoverished in New York City. And keep in mind, photographers of the time had to develop a new set of skills in order to record the conditions in tenements, because they were by and large dark and dreary places that required photographers to push the limits of existing flash powder technology. In the end, we have to recognize that while the word muckrakers was originally intended as an insult, it came to be a badge of honor. The involvement of Roosevelt in the positive impacts of muckraking certainly would seem to demonstrate that while he was somewhat critical of their tendency to look down at the worst aspects of society, he was prepared to clean up the mess that they saw there. The images, both visual and verbal, made the nation aware of injustices from child labor to the complete corruption of the Senate. And as Streitmatter notes in the end, that the list of achievements contained in your chapter is somewhat limited. If it were more expansive, according to Streitmatter, it would include everybody's exposés of the inner workings of the stock market and fraud among life insurance companies, Collier's assault on the autocratic leaders of the House of Representatives, and American Magazine's denunciation of society's shameful treatment of African Americans. Muckraking journalism, while not the only form of journalism being practiced at the time, was intimately connected to the progressive era and demonstrates the potential for journalism to perform the watchdog function that the framers intended it to perform. It certainly gives us a fine example of journalism that comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. Next time we will discuss Chapter 7, Defying the Ku Klux Klan.